Pushing Back the Shadows, support and awareness for mental health.
Hello and welcome to episode 21 of the Pushing Back the Shadows podcast. My name's Alex Davis. I'm the founder of Pushing Back the Shadows and the main author behind the blog. Now, I'd like to start this episode with a question. And it's one of those questions that you're either going to like or you're going to hate. I'm not entirely sure which. So the question is this: do you think that we, as mental health sufferers, are the biggest barrier to change? Do you think that we, as mental health sufferers, are the biggest barrier to change? Now, it sounds like a little bit of an odd question, but bear with me on this one because I think the meaning will become clear in a little bit. Why am I asking that question? Well, to give you a little bit of background, it goes back to a conversation that I was having the other day on Twitter. Now, those of you who followed the blog for a little while will have surely seen our page all about understanding self-harm. It's a page that is designed to give people who've got no experience of mental health struggles a guide into self-harm, and it also looks at some of the different ways that they can support somebody who is self-harming, as well as some of the reasoning behind why people choose to self-harm. Now, it's obviously it's done from my perspective as a former self-harmer. At least I say former. I don't think that anybody really can be a former self-harmer because the temptation will always be there. But so far I've managed not to do it for a little while now, which I think in itself is quite, I'm quite pleased with. But anyway, it's done from that perspective to try and give people the tools that they need to support a friend or a family member who's struggling in that way. Because it's one of the topics that's almost more taboo. People don't talk about it, they avoid it if possible, and consequently nobody really knows quite how to deal with it. And so I put this page up on Twitter while I was doing some of the advertising for the website on social media, and it caused a bit of an uproar. Now, the reason being, people didn't like the picture that I used. They really didn't like the picture that I used. Now, if you're interested in seeing this picture, and I do have to state that there is a possible trigger warning, a possible trigger in this page itself, because it does talk about self-harm. If you want to see the picture, the link is in the description, so do feel free to check that out. Maybe have a browse of the page if you're not familiar with self-harm. But in a nutshell, the image itself is of some self-harm scars. Now, they are healed scars, they're not fresh or anything. Two of them are slightly redder, but there is nothing there that has like any blood on it. None of them are open, nothing like that. The person whose arm it is not in the process of doing anything. They are just completely healed scars. And a lot of people came back and said that I shouldn't have posted it. We had a number of Twitter users say that it was triggering, or it was something that could trigger other people, or that it really should not be on Twitter. Now, the argument was that mostly that it was triggering, but also that there wasn't exactly a trigger warning with it, which I found particularly difficult to comprehend, because if it's on Twitter, how are you going to get a trigger warning there before they see the picture? But that's beside the point. But the reasoning behind that question that I asked at the start of this episode is because I thought, well, self-harm is one of those topics that realistically you need to talk about. And you do, don't you? You need to talk about it. It is one of the crucial parts of mental health. I know every mental health struggle is as important as the next, but self-harm, suicide, those are two of the cornerstone topics. They're two things that a lot of people do not understand. And might not understand until they've experienced it. And that's what I try and tackle. Now, those of you who are familiar with the site and familiar with my work will be familiar with the fact that I do try and tackle every single topic and cover it so that people will be able to understand. And so it came as a bit of a shock when people responded in the way that they did. Now, I can understand their reasoning. Triggers are very unique for different people, and they can present themselves as challenging for people who are experiencing those triggers. It can be difficult to ignore them. I used to find that getting on the bus to go to work before I got my car was something that would trigger me. I'd be having anxious thoughts before I'd even got on the bus, and that was just while waiting for the bus. So I do understand triggers. I don't necessarily always agree with looking for triggers, because I do wonder, what if it's like a Titanic in the iceberg situation? I see the trigger coming, I can't avoid it, and that just flips me off straight away. But I do understand the concept of triggers. But why am I asking whether we as mental health sufferers are the biggest barrier to change? Realistically, one thing that is almost unanimous in the mental health community is that we want society's views of mental health to change. And we do. We don't like the way it's perceived, with stigma, the fact that people say, you know, if you're self-harming, you're just attention-seeking, or if you're suicidal, you're being selfish, or even if you're depressed, you're just unhappy and you need to think positively. We want those things to change, because we all know, those of us who suffer, we know that those things are not true. Granted, in some cases, those will be the truth, but for most of the cases, it's not like that. And yet society perceives it in that way, and we need it to change. I see so many hashtags talking about the stigma, mental health awareness, end the stigma, stop the stigma. But I do genuinely wonder, are we the biggest barrier to that change? What do you think?
You're listening to Pushing Back the Shadows.
So are we, as mental health sufferers, a barrier to change? It's a pretty difficult question to answer, because we don't necessarily have that answer to give. We don't know whether we are stopping change. We don't really know whether we're making change. It's something that, just like progress, can be very difficult to determine. If you think about it, if you look at a pond and you throw a stone in the water, you can see the ripples, you can see the change. But with society and with changing the world, it's slightly harder to see those ripples, because after all, we don't know what happens as soon as we leave that person's presence. We don't know what will happen. With running a blog, for example, it's difficult to see on the other end of a computer screen what kind of impact we're having, unless people make a comment, or unless people, like on social media, like the tweet or the Facebook post or whatever. It's difficult to know whether our work is actually reaching people and whether or not it's making the change. And so I guess in some respects it's helpful to get the comments that I did get, even though they were predominantly negative. At the same time, I've had some rather positive ones since, and it's been encouraging. I know that I'm making some kind of impression. Whether or not it's the change I want to make, I don't know. But I know that I am making that impression. But my thoughts kind of stemmed from those predominantly negative comments that I got. I don't know the people involved. I'll be completely honest, I do not know them. I don't know whether they have mental health issues, or whether they have self-harmed in the past, or whether they don't fit those categories at all. I don't know. But a lot of them did come back and say that they found the image particularly triggering, or that it shouldn't belong on social media, on Twitter. And I found it quite interesting, because when I first started struggling with self-harm, and I was looking for some kind of support, I found that there wasn't really anything out there. It would have been very useful to have some kind of guide out there to explain to my parents why I felt the need to self-harm. It would have been useful to be able to explain to friends and other family members why I felt that need. And yet there wasn't anything that would do that. And I found it very frustrating that I couldn't find anything other than my own words to try and describe what I was feeling. You know, the fact that I would get so numb that I would do it so I could feel something, or the fact that sometimes it was just the only thing that could distract me from the tumultuous voices cascading through my head. So it came as quite a surprise that people reacted in that way, and it really set me thinking. My thoughts were kind of along the lines of, well, actually, do you know what? I'm putting this out there so that more people can understand self-harm, so that more people can support those who are going through it. And yet, everybody's reaction is telling me to take it down, telling me to change the image. Now, the reasoning behind the image itself was to try and bring about almost a little bit of a shock factor. I don't normally like doing things like that, like clickbait and shock tactics. Normally I say that I would raise my voice for that kind of shock and awe thing. I wouldn't just raise my voice for the sake of it. And I guess it's similar principles on social media. If I do something that's kind of along the more drastic side of things, it's because I will really want to make the point. And with some people, they don't necessarily understand just how serious self-harm is. So I grabbed that image thinking, do you know what? This is one that will get people to actually take a look. It's uncomfortable. It's not the nicest of things to be seeing, and so realistically people will possibly want to find out more. They'll want to come over to the page and see, well, actually, is this as serious as it looks? And in all honesty, after I reviewed some of the statistics on the website, it worked. We had a lot of people come over, and a lot of people were reading through those posts. But still I was being told to take it down. So it made me wonder, when we've got people who are standing up for mental health, and I'm not just talking about me, I'm talking about everybody who stands up for mental health on a daily basis. When we're saying, oh no, you shouldn't be doing that, you shouldn't be talking about this, you shouldn't be tackling that issue, you shouldn't be doing, are we not actually hampering the progress of the change that we want to see in the world? Are we not hampering the progress of the change that we want to see in the world? Because if we've got people who are standing up, who are talking about these subjects, these uncomfortable and painful subjects, because believe me, talking about my own self-harm comes with its share of negative emotions. I can feel guilty for what I've done. I can look at it and think that actually I feel guilty for the fact that I don't really feel that bothered about what I've done. And there are a lot of things like that that come through. But when we've got things like that, and we're standing up and we're talking about them, and people are actually turning around and saying, oh no, you shouldn't be talking about that, is that not another way of saying, if we've got a problem, you know, sit down, shut up, don't talk about it? Because realistically, that's how it comes across. If we, as mental health sufferers, are trying to quiet other mental health sufferers who are speaking out about the struggle, are we not just burying our heads in the sand? Now, granted that this image will have triggered some people, and I know that, but realistically, I make no apologies. It's a subject that does need to be talked about, and granted, other people may feel differently, but I would put up 1,000 images that would trigger me if I knew it was going to change somebody else. If I knew that it would change the world, if I knew it would make a difference, I would put up loads of images that would trigger me. Because even if I only got one person who's got no idea about mental health, no idea about the struggles that we go through on a daily basis, to actually get a glimmer of understanding, all my pain and all my suffering would be worth it. And I genuinely mean that. All my pain and all my suffering would be worth it. But to go back to that point that I just made, where mental health sufferers might be trying to keep other mental health sufferers quiet, I'll put my teeth back in a minute. It's exactly the same as having an incredibly chauvinistic boss and all the women of the workplace feeling very uncomfortable, but nobody wants to speak out because nobody wants to make it worse. And therefore things keep going the way they've always gone, everything happens the way it always has, nothing changes because nobody will speak up. It's the same principle. If we don't speak up, and if we don't allow ourselves to break free from the crowd and speak out for our struggles, nothing is going to change, will it? But do we really want that change? Do we really want that change?
You're listening to Pushing Back the Shadows.
I can almost hear you now saying, well, yes, what are you talking about? Of course I want that change. Mental health stigma needs to be eradicated, and we need perceptions to change. But hear me out on this one. There's a running joke that we have in churches, and I'm sure it kind of expands into other areas as well. But it's one of those things where the preacher stood up in the pulpit and he says things like, "Who wants a change?" And the congregation comes back with, "We do!" And he says, "Who wants to change?" And then all you get is kind of the cricket sounds and the tumbleweed. Because when it comes down to it, nobody wants to make the change. They want the benefits, they want to reap the rewards of the change, but they don't actually want to make the change themselves. And I wonder whether or not it's the same with people in their mental health struggles. Do we actually want to change? The kind of classic example I can think of is the person who would do loads and loads of jobs, always helping other people out, but always saying, "Oh, I'm so rushed off my feet, I'm so tired, I don't stop, I do this, that and the other." But then when they're given the opportunity to do less, it's, well, actually, no, I like being recognised for what I do. I like getting the attention, so I don't want to change anything. And it makes me wonder, are we comfortable in our diagnosis? Are we comfortable in the way society perceives us? I'll give you just a moment to think about that, because I do genuinely wonder this. It is a question that I've asked myself a few times. Are we comfortable in our diagnosis? Are we comfortable with our place in society? You see, some people would say, they might argue that being put into the spotlight is uncomfortable. You have your skeletons in the closet, you have your self-harm scars, you have everything that society has taught us to hide coming out into the open. And you're gonna take a lot of flack for it. Like my guide to understanding self-harm, I took a lot of flack for that the other day. And yet, realistically, who knows what change it would have made? So I ask you again, do we really want the change? Because change is uncomfortable. It really is. It's very uncomfortable. I remember talking with my dad. There was somebody that I was supporting in my church, and I was getting particularly frustrated at one point because I'm saying, well, they just keep going back to what they've always done and then seem surprised at the results. You know, if you always do what you've always done, you're always going to get what you always got. And Dad turned around and said, well, yeah, but that's what they're comfortable with. Why are they going to make the change when they're comfortable? And it set me thinking for this particular episode. If we are comfortable where we are, why are we going to make a change? And that's the whole point with change. We want things to change, so we've got to get out of our comfort zone. It's almost like we want the better world, but we don't want to put the work in. We want society's perceptions to change, but we don't want the discomfort of having to talk about our struggle. Do you think that's a fair point? Is that something that you've experienced for yourself? Would you say that you might be one of those people, or do you know one of those people? Are we comfortable where we are? You see, a comfort zone is nice. We feel nice and we feel secure, but it doesn't get us anywhere. When I started this website, I knew that there was a possibility that it would just flop completely. But without taking the risk, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today. I mean, we looked at our end of year figures, and to be perfectly honest, they blew me away. The number of people that we have reached, the number of people that we've helped. And if I hadn't taken that first step and said, look, I'm going to talk about my mental health struggle, we wouldn't have got there. We would not be where we are today. And that's from me leaving my comfort zone to talk about something that is very personal, but at the same time, very discomforting to talk about. So tell me, are we comfortable where we are? The other thing I wonder is whether we're content to be the kind of community that takes but does not give. We're all very willing when other people do stand up and advocate on our behalf to take the results, to reap the benefits, but are we willing to actually give something to that struggle as well? A lot of people will just sit on the sidelines. They won't raise their voices. They won't show any kind of support. They'll just let somebody else do the work for them. Now, I understand, because as somebody who struggles with anxiety, I understand that that can be a very, very daunting prospect. To get up and to give voice to something that can paralyze us with fear or anxiety is incredibly difficult. But not everyone is like that. And that's the thing. I'm not saying that we as individuals should all throw ourselves into the cause and all try and make a change. What I'm saying is that those of us who can, should. Those of us who can, should. And it doesn't have to be the big, grand gestures of starting a website and going and doing public speaking and doing everything else that everybody who's like a big name in mental health advocacy does. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that we should all do our part. It might be that we have one person that we know and we can go and change their view, or it might be that we are destined to do something big, like write a book or go and do public speaking, touring the world to speak about mental health. Whatever it is that we feel we can do, if we know there's something, an area where we can contribute, then we should contribute. Like I said in episode 18, if not us, then who? Society doesn't want the change. Because they're comfortable, they're happy right where they are, with mental health being the taboo subject that people don't talk about. We want the change, so we have to fight for it. You and me have to fight for the change. And it's gonna be uncomfortable. I'm going to tell you now, I'm going to be honest, it will be uncomfortable. There'll be things that we will have to say, things that we will have to do that will feel incredibly difficult and incredibly uncomfortable to do. Talking about our self-harm scars, for example. It won't be easy. But that's the biggest part of change. If we want the change, it's the only way that we are going to make that change. So to finish off, I will ask you the question that I started with. Are we, as mental health sufferers, the biggest barrier to change? Are we comfortable in our position in society? And do we really want the change? I want the change. What about you?
You've been listening to Pushing Back the Shadows. To find out more, head over to pushingbacktheshadows.com and hit subscribe to get all of our latest updates straight to your inbox. Alternatively, connect with us on Facebook, which is facebook.com/AlexDavisPBTS, or you can visit us on Twitter at AlexDavisPBTS. Enable Pushing Back the Shadows to continue supporting people in the mental health community, their friends and their family. By pledging just $1 a month, you could help us to continue supporting people with depression, with anxiety, with bipolar and other mental illnesses. You can also unlock exclusive rewards, behind the scenes, sneak previews of upcoming posts and much, much more. So head over to www.patreon.com/AlexDavisPBTS to find out more.